To give an example, about a month ago, I was having trouble with the electronics in my car. There was something going wrong with it in some part of the car. And I was having this trouble, and so I called out the AA man to come and fix it. And he came, and we got in this conversation. And he was asking about what I was doing here, and about the place, about the church. And he seemed fairly knowledgeable about church matters. And so I said to him, do you have any faith yourself? And he said, I'm a Catholic, very definitely a lapsed Catholic. A lot of emphasis on that. So I said, okay, well why is that? Why are you lapsed? And he said, to be honest, I'm just too much of a rational guy to believe in religion. I'm just too much convinced of the science to accept that there could possibly be a God. And in response to that, I laughed, which I don't think he was expecting, but I just thought, well, here we go again. That same old chestnut being trotted out. And then we got into a bit of a conversation, and I asked him a few questions to try and understand how he'd reached those conclusions that he'd reached. And this is the first kind of preliminary point that I want to make tonight before we even get into some arguments for God's existence. A Catholic apologist named Trent Horn, I don't know if Colin in his apologetics to come across him, but Trent Horn says that to be a good apologist, a good defender of the faith, you don't always have to remember all the right answers. Sometimes it is a good enough start to ask the right questions. Why do you think that? How does that logically follow what you're saying? Sometimes this is enough to get the person to clarify their position in a way that maybe they haven't even done for themselves before. And it might be a way to help them see something that's missing or contradictory in their logic, in the conclusion that they've come to. The most obvious example that Trent Horn gives is a man who comes and says to him, you can't pretend that there's an absolute truth. There is no absolute truth. And Trent Horn responded and said, and are you absolutely sure there is no absolute truth? The point being, it would be that in itself would be an absolute truth to say there is absolutely no absolute truth. So it contradicts the man's very statements. I think asking questions can easily be helpful if we're in a debate about the existence of God, so that the onus of proof is not completely on us, but also on the person who doubts that existence, who rejects it. A couple of other points before I come to some arguments for God's existence. The AA man who I spoke to said he didn't believe in God because of the science. Presumably he meant in fact more recent scientists like Stephen Hawking or Richard Dawkins, who have been openly skeptical about the existence of God. And I think here we have to be careful of giving scientists as a group an authority beyond their own discipline. John Lennox, who's a professor of mathematics at Oxford, a bioethicist, he says that when it comes to something outside of the scientist's field, the scientist is just as clueless as the next man. When it comes to something outside of the scientist's field, the scientist is just as clueless as the next man. And God is something clearly outside the scientist's remit, since by science we mean the study, measurement of observable phenomena in the universe, and by God we mean an uncaused cause of all things that is other than and outside of created things, and therefore of necessity is spiritual and not material. In other words, we cannot put God under a microscope. We cannot prove or disprove him scientifically. There's a story that Yuri Gagarin, the first Russian astronaut in space, went up into space and he commented on the radio to the people down below, well, I'm up here in space and I don't see God up here. And C.S. Lewis commented on that. He said, well, that's as silly as Hamlet Shakespeare in the play of Shakespeare going up to his attic saying, well, I don't see Shakespeare up here. God is someone of necessity outside of the created universe, and we cannot scientifically observe him directly. That said, I will argue that we can know God through the observation of created things, but this is by using our reasoning to to reach conclusions from those things that we see, which we see as God's effects in the universe. We're not pretending to put God himself under a microscope, but to conclude that he exists because we see his footprints, as it were, in creation. One more point to make about God and science before we look at some of the reasons for God's existence. Many people, like my AA man, will assume that Christianity and science are incompatible with each other, that they're enemies of each other intellectually. And it's important for us not to let this assumption pass, because in fact the modern discipline of science has only been able to come about as a result of the Judeo-Christian tradition and belief. The priest-scientist Stanley L. Jackie points out that many ancient cultures made technical and scientific breakthroughs here and there in the past. So the Chinese gave us gunpowder and magnets, the Egyptians found a way to build pyramids, and the Greeks gave us the beginnings of geometry and algebra and medicine, and other breakthroughs were made in Hindu, Aztec, Babylonian, and Arabic civilizations. But here's the thing, because these cultures by and large had superstitious beliefs about the universe and its creation, that the world was an unintended, accidental product of warring gods, for example, that it is unpredictable and capricious, that the universe is illusory, that it progresses not in linear fashion through time, but in this kind of endless cyclical fashion that can't really be measured. All these beliefs made it hard to take the observation and measurement of the universe seriously. Whereas the Judeo-Christian tradition, which says that the universe was created good and beautiful, as a reflection of God's goodness and beauty, that it is knowable, since God made it for man to know, love, and serve him, and that therefore it also has a purpose, the universe, and that it was created by God not out of accidental chaos, but in an ordered and deliberate and peaceful fashion. In Genesis, God says, "Let there be light," and there is light, and so on. All of that in Genesis is to portray, express how God creates in a deliberate and ordered way, that the universe's laws are dependable and measurable because those laws are fixed by God. All these beliefs of the Judeo-Christian tradition obviously helped to create a culture in which the study and measurement of the universe could be taken seriously. And so it was only in Christendom, in Christianity in the Middle Ages, that science came to birth as a sustained system of knowledge. And we find in this great figures like St. Albert the Great, who was the teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Albert was an authority on physics, geography, astronomy, mineralogy, chemistry, zoology, and physiology. Or there's St. Hildegard von Bingen, an abbess of a convent, and she was a pioneer in biology and ecology, as well as a great writer of church music, and so on. So you get this flourishing of science precisely through that Christian culture and because of what it believes about God and about the universe being worth observing and possible to observe. I made this point just to show that we need to challenge the assumptions people make so easily today about God and science, and not let them off the hook too quickly when they say they don't believe in God because they are too rational and scientific. So the question at hand, is it reasonable to believe that God exists? This is a real question that we're asking. Let's look at what the Church says about it at the First Vatican Council in 1870. You've all heard a lot about the Second Vatican Council. It's important that we don't forget the First Vatican Council, which in some ways was much more important, certainly dogmatically. On the question of knowing God's existence, Vatican I's dogmatic constitution on the faith Dei Filius says, quote, "Holy Mother Church holds and teaches that God, the beginning and end of all things, may be certainly known by the natural light of human reason by means of created things." So in short, the Church says, yes, we can know for certain that God exists, not just kind of have an opinion or guess. We can know for certain that God exists. And notice what it says, by the natural light of human reason. So in other words, this isn't just a matter of faith. A person without faith can come to a certain knowledge of God's existence simply by the light of their human reason. Hence the book of Wisdom says in chapter 13, for all men who were ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable from the good things that are seen to know him who exists, nor did they recognize the craftsman while paying heed to his works. And in a like manner, St. Paul writes to the Romans, but what can be known about God is plain to men, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. Someone might object here and say, well, if it can be certainly known that God exists from looking at the universe around us, how come so many people, and even many clever people, don't believe in God? Here, St. Thomas Aquinas makes the point that just because God's existence is a truth that can be known certainly, doesn't mean that it's a truth that is necessarily self-evident. And this is because of the fall. After the fall, man's reason was darkened, so that many truths that should be obvious to him are not. He often has to strive to apprehend and perceive these truths. But the point is that anyone can apprehend those truths if they're of goodwill and ready to use their reasoning faculties. So this brings us on to some arguments for God's existence. There are, of course, many reasons, and from many different angles, but I'll touch on just 3 of them tonight. 2 of these are found in the famous 5 proofs of the existence of God of St. Thomas Aquinas. And the first is what's called the argument from design. So looking at the universe, it is impossible to escape a sense of order and design in it, whether it be the progression of the seasons, or the behavior of the birds and beasts, or the orbits of the planets. And this observation naturally leads people to posit a mind behind all of this, since in our own activities, we see that order is the product of conscious purpose, a mind that is ordering. Albert Einstein described the universe as a big library with books in many different languages. We know someone must have written and arranged those books, he says, even if we do not yet know who that person is. The 16th century philosopher Francis Bacon, who sometimes people try and claim was an atheist, he once declared, I had rather believe all the fables in the legend and the Talmud and the Al-Quran than that this universal frame, that is, the universe, is without mind. So that there's a mind behind the order of the universe. St. Thomas Aquinas puts the argument from design in this way. He says, we see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, whether that be planets or unconscious things on the earth, they act for an end, for a purpose. And this is evident from their acting always, or nearly always, in the same way, so as to obtain the best results. Hence, it is plain that not by chance, but designedly do they achieve their end. Now, the strange thing about the modern atheist is that they will say there is no God, no designer, but then continue to talk as if there were some kind of overarching design in creation. They talk about the so-called selfish gene that ensures the, quote, evolution of the species and the, quote, survival of the fittest. They claim that all our human instincts and cultural behavior are programmed for the preservation of our race or in obedience to the laws of evolution. So they use the language of progress, of design and purpose, but then they say that ultimately the universe has no designer and no purpose. It's like saying that we are characters in a well-written story that no one has written. In fact, it seems to me that these people still believe in God, it's just they've taken him out of heaven and put him in the gene pool. Cardinal Henry Manning, writing at the end of the 19th century, commented on the fact that the scientists of his day thought they had discovered the prime matter that gave birth to all conscious organic life. And they called this thing, this prime matter, bathybios or bathybios, and argued that this discovery did away with the need for God. Cardinal Manning wrote in response, "Is it easier to believe in an eternal bathybios than an eternal creator, an eternal slime than an eternal intelligence?" And he concludes, "The plain English of these theories is, anything you will, only no creator." So his point is that in order to avoid God, the atheist has to make a long, roundabout way to a belief that is, at the end of the day, much less convincing. The second argument I want to share is the argument from contingency, as it's called. I'll express this argument very briefly. Like the argument from design, this is also found in the 5 proofs of St. Thomas Aquinas. What is something that's contingent? A contingent being simply means a being that has a beginning and an end, a being that doesn't have to exist. You and I need not have existed. We are contingent beings. We depend on something else to give us existence. We had a beginning, and one day we will have an end, which we saw in the liturgy of Ash Wednesday, with the ashing of the forehead to show that one day we will be dust to dust. We'll have an end in this life, at least, although not in the life to come. This chapel need never have been built by the Manic family, and one day, presumably, it will no longer be here. The sun in the sky has not always existed, and one day it will cease to be. And if we look for the origin of each new thing in something that came before it, and so on, all the way back to the beginning of creation, the ultimate question still remains, why is there something rather than nothing? When did something begin to exist? This was a question that the priest and philosopher Frederick Copleston put to the atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell in a famous radio debate in 1948. And Russell's answer to this question, why is there something rather than nothing, his answer was basically, well, the universe is just here. There's no point asking that question. It's not a legitimate question. But for a philosopher whose whole job is to ask why, for him to say we can't ask why about the most pressing question in human history, a question that many civilizations have pondered and tried in different ways to answer, seems a cop-out at the very least. It furthermore seems that unless we are to carry on back in an infinite regression of beginnings and origins, which even then wouldn't adequately explain itself, then the only reasonable conclusion is to conclude that the origin of all contingent beings is a being that is not contingent. That is what we call necessary, a being who is the sufficient explanation of his own existence. And that is what we mean by the word God. And the third argument for the existence of God, I'll share tonight, is the argument from morality. And in some ways, I think this is the easiest argument to put to atheists and really put them on the hot seats. Almost all atheists, unless they really are just complete anarchists, will live by a moral code and believe that other people should do too. In fact, they will get very indignant with people who are not living in what they perceive to be a moral way, rightly or wrongly. Whether it's dictators in the Middle East, now we might cite the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, or people who they think are irresponsible for not getting the vaccine, or religious people who they think are corrupt and hypocritical, very often the atheist will have righteous indignation towards those that they perceive to be in some way immoral. We have only to think back 10 years or so ago to the days of the so-called new atheists like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, who were always angry at somebody and with righteous anger. And yet they will just as quickly say that there is no objective morality outside of us, since there is no God who has created us for an ultimate purpose. And so morality is simply what we as human beings have made of it, a construct of human beings to help further the preservation of the race. Okay, very well. So if morality has no eternal origin, but only a material origin, if it, along with us, is apparently just a product of evolution, then why should the atheist get indignant with a person who chooses to ignore morality? Why should he care if someone is irresponsible, or tyrannical, or hypocritical, or dishonest, any more than he cares if that person has a different favorite color from him? Because according to the atheist, there is no more objective value in the decision whether or not to attack a country or tell a lie in court than there is in whether we decide to wear a red shirt or a green shirt first thing in the morning. If everything, including morality, is just a result of evolution from unconscious matter, and we have no actual purpose, then why does the atheist care about the way that other people behave? This is one area where very clearly the atheist lives at odds with what they actually believe. Whereas the Christian says, if I have this innate moral sense, it must be a reflection of something outside of me. Cardinal Manning says, since I have found in myself certain necessary truths, both intellectual and moral, I believe that what is in me by consequence or derivation should be in my cause by original possession. That is, that between it and me there is a likeness. In other words, if I am moral, it's because outside of me there is a morality in my cause, in the one who caused me. Which shows that not only does the cause of the universe have a mind, since there is purpose and order in his creation, he also has a heart, so to speak, a benevolent will, because he makes us aware of good and its opposite, evil. It would be preposterous to think that we have this moral sense in us and that God doesn't have it, just as it would be preposterous to think that we instinctively look for order and purpose in the universe, and there isn't any. So these are three arguments for God's existence, having gone through them briefly, from design, from contingency, why is there something rather than nothing, and from morality, why should we be bothered about being moral at all if it's simply a human construct. Of course, there are many other reasons, many other arguments. One of my old seminary professors said that all these many arguments are like the single threads of one big rope that together is too thick for the skeptic's objections to cut. From reason and experience, and also from the light of faith, we see how everything in creation points us to the Creator, not only to know Him, but also to serve Him and love Him. Bless the Lord, all ye works of the Lord. Praise and exalt Him above all forever. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall, world without end. Amen. Give your blessing, benedictio Dei, Pater,